There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a podcast as vast as space and as timeless as The Simpsons. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, and it lies between the trench of Jack Evans and the summit of his anus. This is the podcast of random bullshitting. It is an area which we call the VHS tapes. And now, for our first stories of the evening, I give you to 6 Foot Piss Radius.
Hello, everybody. This is 6 Foot Piss Radius, and for my segment for this episode, I'll be reading a collection of short stories, short scary stories from Reddit. So hopefully, that'll help you get in the Halloween spirit. I used to live in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco, one of the seediest neighborhoods of San Francisco and home to the most deadly corner in San Francisco, Turk Street and Jones Street to be specific. It was generally not a safe place to walk at night, and after a certain hour, everything but the liquor stores close. One night a few blocks from Turk and Jones, I was walking around the corner from my apartment, rushing to pick up some dinner, when across the street I saw two men awkwardly shuffling down the sidewalk. It was cold out, even for San Francisco, and the two men were bundled up in heavy jackets. They appeared to be hugging or holding each other, but I couldn't quite tell. It turned out the one guy was pulling the other guy against his will. The guy being dragged was smaller than the other guy and was struggling to get away. I had continued walking, but stopped when the bigger guy slammed the smaller guy into a driveway gate, and the chain padlock rang loudly against the metal gate. This drew my attention, as well as the attention of an old lady on the same side of the street as them. The smaller guy began to struggle more violently, yelling, "No!" and some other stuff I couldn't hear from across the street. I contemplated continuing on and not getting involved, but I knew I would regret it if I did nothing. The old lady had stopped her forward progress as the men were still struggling, and she was headed in their direction. I stepped into the street and began to cross. The old lady saw me and, emboldened by my appearance, asked them what was going on. They ignored her. As I got closer, I could see that the smaller man was weeping, and though he was hysterical, his resolve now seemed weakened, and he wasn't putting up much of a fight against the bigger man. Both men were Hispanic, and the smaller man was very short, and the bigger man was about average height. As I got closer, I could hear the smaller man's cries, and realized he was speaking Spanish, which I speak. I asked in English if everything was all right. The smaller man didn't acknowledge me, but the bigger man looked at me and said everything was fine. He was still holding the smaller man up against the gate. I looked directly at the smaller man and asked him in Spanish if he was okay, and if he knew the bigger man. Again, he didn't look at me or even respond. He was openly weeping, and he kept saying to the bigger man, "No quiero ir ahí, hay muertos ahí," which in Spanish means, "I don't want to go there. There are dead there." I took a moment to digest those words, and the bigger man looked at me and said, "It's nothing. He just forgot to take his pills. He's crazy." The bigger man did not seem particularly threatened by my appearance, nor did he appear angry or hostile, aside from violently dragging this man down the street. I'd see crazy drugged-out people doing and saying insane things daily in that neighborhood, so it wouldn't be unusual to see someone tripping hard in that area. I wasn't sure who to believe. At some point, the old lady had disappeared, and I was left alone with a difficult decision to make. I asked the smaller man if he needed help, and if he wanted me to call the police. He ignored me, whimpered, and after a brief silence, the two men began walking away. The bigger man still holding the smaller man. I started to walk away, feeling I had done everything I could, and reassuring myself that the guy was probably just tripping his balls off, and needed to go home and rest. Still, there remained a sliver of doubt. The smaller man, except for his extreme fear, seemed pretty coherent. He became calm whenever I tried to talk to him, as if he knew he had to stay quiet or something bad would happen to him. I couldn't shake the feeling that this guy was involved with some bad people and he was in danger. I called 911 and reported what had happened. I saw the two men turning the corner and raced to catch up. When I got to the corner, they were already halfway down the block and were disappearing into a building. The only building on the block with lights on. 30 seconds later, a confused group of young people burst out of the front door looking around for something. At the same time, a police car pulled up, and the young people started explaining to the police officers that two strange men burst into their community theater, made a whole bunch of noise, scared a bunch of people, and then disappeared. I went over, explained that I had made the 911 call and told them what happened earlier. The two men had now disappeared. I figured there wasn't much else I could do, so I turned around and went on my way, back around the corner. When I got back to the locked gate, where I had first encountered the two men, I heard commotion in the alleyway. It was the two men. They were arguing, and the smaller man was still trying to break free, and the bigger man was hitting him and rushing to get down the alley. A couple of young people from the theater came out after them and yelled at them to stop, but the two men continued and vanished into the darkness of the alley. Seconds later, two policemen emerged out of the back entrance of the theater and went down the alley, but it was too late. The men had disappeared. I stuck around and talked with the theater people for a bit. They were all freaked out by what happened. There were several apartment buildings that were accessible from the alley, and the police had no idea which one they disappeared into. I checked into the police reports the next few days for any more clues as to what happened, but I never found out. I really hope it was just a bad drug trip or the guy was really off his meds. I don't know, though. Still rubs me the wrong way when I remember the look of fear in the man's eyes, followed by defeat and despair, as he apparently felt. He couldn't speak to me and allow me to help him. I was about 14 at the time, in grade 9, and the first few days of school I would walk home. I lived about 20 to 30 minutes away from my school if I took the back ways, which were nice suburban areas. My uncle lived about 7 minutes away from the school, but still on the path home, and his divorced/widowed friend lived next door. Let's call him Bill. I knew the guy, and he came to family functions with my uncle and stuff. He taught me a lot of random facts like Gathering of Owls is called a parliament, and taught me how to do funny impressions like Jimmy Stewart and Jack Nicholson, and just stupid shit like that really funny guy and really enjoyed being in his company. I was walking home from school in about end of October, and my uncle was out having a beer with him, and he offered me one, and my uncle and I shot the shit all the time. Yes, it was underage drinking, but I never got fucked up. I thought he was the coolest guy ever. Fast forward to the summer, I was going into grade 10. Bill would always wave and stuff when he saw me in town. I'd mow the guy's lawn for money and just hang out with him. Well, anywho, there was this sort of last week of summer party in the area. My parents knew I had to be home, and my uncle was out of town for some Chrysler meeting or whatever. Bill was a pensioner, and he was looking out for his house while he was gone. The night of the party, I have this bad feeling and just this premonition that something was going to go down. So me being the crazy, overprotective kid I was, stashed a pocket knife in my coat and kept it in the coat room the entire night. I get a little tipsy and the party was winding down, so I decided to go home. It was about 10:30 on a Friday night, so it was good to walk home while it was still a bit light out. Bill was just pulling into his garage. He waved and got my attention and said, "You need a place to crash?" I tell him no thanks and that my parents don't even know that the party existed. So I'd be in shit if I wasn't in my bed the next morning. I continued to walk, thinking nothing of his offer. I go to the crosswalk nearing my street, and this car has been traveling down the road for what seemed like forever. Our town is sort of a commuter town to get to the 401, and we get a lot of random cars. As I'm walking past the crosswalk, Bill's truck violently screeches towards this parking lot, and he got out and sternly said, "It'd be a lot easier if you just fucking slept over." I reached for my pocket knife, brandished it, and didn't really get a further approach from him. I ran towards a house that led close, but not into my backyard. I ran inside and called 911. Turns out he killed himself that night because he didn't want to go to prison. If I trusted this family friend, I could have been raped or worse. I'm 16 and I'm still wary of the people who claim to be my neighbors and friends. So my mom is 56 years old and the oldest of 5 children. 3 sisters and a brother, who is the youngest. When she was about 10 or 12, growing up in the late 1960s near Birmingham, Alabama, my grandfather decided to take her and the rest of the kids out into the woods to teach them how to fire a handgun for protection. They were going to shoot at tin cans in the woods, basically. It was fall and the ground was covered with dead leaves. While deep in the woods, my grandfather heard crackling sound and a car engine. Suspicious of who would be driving a vehicle this deep into the woods, my grandfather told my mother and her siblings to hide under a large pile of leaves and stay silent. A man got out of the car and dragged the body of a middle-aged African-American woman out into the woods. She was either unconscious or stone-cold dead. Her wig was falling off, her clothes were torn, her purse was open, and the contents falling out onto the ground. The man just dumped her there, got back into the car, and drove off. My grandfather waited a while before retrieving the kids and rushing them back home as quickly as possible. Here's the really creepy part. The next morning, my mother saw the same man parked in that car at the bus stop while she and her siblings waited for the school bus. My grandfather later returned to that spot in the woods to investigate, but the body was gone. He did, however, retrieve the woman's empty purse and passed it on to the police. To this day, my mother has no idea who the woman was or if the crime was ever solved. She's just glad she wasn't abducted at that bus stop. I went on a school trip to Jamestown with my class in 8th grade. One of the activities we did was a ghost tour, which obviously was at night. Now, of course, they have things set up to scare people, and especially us as kids, it wasn't really too difficult. The tour guide would stop at random places and tell stories that may or may not have been true, but nonetheless were supposed to give us the chills. My friend and I, meanwhile, weren't really into the tour too much, as it wasn't really believable enough for us, so we just hung in the back, cracking jokes occasionally at how lame this was. At one point, my friend turned around and saw another kid who was even further behind us. He said something about him to me, so I turned around and sure enough, there was another kid behind us, except he wasn't from our class, and looked a couple years too young to be part of our tour. And he was just walking by himself, keeping a good distance away, maybe 20-30 yards. We dismissed this as somewhat odd, and though maybe there was another tour group behind ours, and this kid was just out front, every few minutes, though, we would look back and there would be, walking down the middle of the road, no other person in sight. It was starting to creep us out a little bit, as this didn't seem like something that would be part of the tour. And only my friend and I had noticed because we were a bit out of the way back from our group. We continued on, however, and forgot about the kid. About 20 or so minutes later, I remembered about that creepy kid and looked out. And sure enough, there he was, still behind us, but a little further back now, like 40 or 50 yards, but still in the middle of the street. I elbowed my friend and told him to check it out, that the kid was still following us. We turned around. There was no one there. The street was completely empty, and there was nowhere the kid could have gone. My friend turned back to me and thought I was trying to play a joke on him, but must have seen by my face that I was scared shitless, and immediately we both bolted for the front of the tour group. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened then, and if it was just me, I could have probably convinced myself my memory was just wrong. But my friend remembers everything exactly as I do, and I still get chills thinking about that night. I never truly believed in ghosts. However, my mother showed me a recording she has of our old house that I have a hard time figuring out how she could have possibly faked it, considering she isn't very bright and still calls me to Google things for her, since she doesn't know how to do it herself. I need to dig through storage to find the tape, so maybe I can share it with you. Anyway, this is a description of what is on the tape. So my mom was always telling me our house was haunted, and I never believed her. Part of me still doesn't. However, one day she set up a camera upstairs, pointing down the hall so you could see the bedroom doors right before we all left the house to go watch the Sweeney Todd Demon Barber of Fleet Street on Christmas morning. About 30 minutes after leaving, all 4 doors slammed simultaneously. You can even hear the latches click. And our fat old dog named Valentine, who always had trouble going up the stairs because of her arthritis, came running up the stairs howling. However, instead of facing the doors, she was facing the loft just across the hall from the doors. She got bored and walked downstairs. After a few more minutes, the doors open again, simultaneously, and our dog comes running back upstairs barking. Again, she walks downstairs. This repeats about 3 times before we get home. We viewed the tape and I was super skeptical, but had no idea how to explain it. A couple years later, I came home from a friend's house and there was a note on the kitchen counter saying that my parents went out of town. My brother was at his junior prom and wouldn't be back until the next day. As soon as I set the note down, I started hearing heavy footsteps upstairs that sounded like somebody was running. This was accompanied by the sound of metal clinging together, almost as if somebody was rummaging through a jewelry box. I thought we were being robbed, so I grabbed the largest knife I could find and hid in the pantry. My brother came home the morning after and found me sleeping in the pantry with a knife. I told him about what had happened, so he grabbed the hunting rifle, didn't even know we had guns until that day, and crept upstairs. Everything was exactly the way it was left, and we even sneaked into my parents' room to see if there were any drawers that had been raided. Everything was still there, untouched. I don't know how to explain it, but it was definitely the scariest thing that's ever happened to me.
Originally, the plan was to have Venom Jewbear follow next. Unfortunately, it seems he was brutally murdered in his sleep by an axe-wielding maniac. Unfortunate. So now, I will turn you over to Lord Heroicus for the final story of this episode. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this, and nothing more." Distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here, forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before. So that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." Presently, my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming, dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, Lenore. This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, Lenore. Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. Surely, said I, surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more. Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird, beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on that placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, nevermore. Startled at the stillness broken by reply, so aptly spoken, doubtless, said I, what it is its only stock and store, got from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore, of never, nevermore. But the raven, still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird, and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking, nevermore. This I sat, engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing, to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining, on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er. But whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er, she shall press, nevermore. Then, methought, the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee, respite, respite, and nepenthe from my memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forgot this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore. Tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aiden it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked, upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throw his shadow on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.